Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for the Puppets Bunker. This is the newest 24-man Alliance raid made available by patch 5.3 in Final Fantasy XIV, Reflections in Crystal. While it's easy to be overwhelmed by the order of protocols of each boss, all you need is laser focus and missile precision to outmaneuver your enemies. My name is Miztech and I'll be your raid guide. Players will immediately face the first boss. One thing to note, it is very possible and very easy to fall off the platform, so watch your step. Order Anti-Personnel Laser will target each tank with a heavy-hitting tank buster, cooldown shield, and heal as necessary. Maneuver Beam Cannons will form large laser beam telegraphs that will begin to converge on specific locations. This can be tricky to recognize at first since the laser beams can overlap on their way to their attack spots. Players will need to move into the safe zones before the blasts go off or they will get knocked off the platform and die. Maneuver Collider Cannons will spawn a number of moving laser telegraphs that rotate around the platform. These attacks blast as soon as they stop moving, so make sure to pre-position out of these before they stop on top of you. Firing Order Surface Laser will mark up players from each alliance with this orange marker before blasting them with AoE attacks that follow them for some time. Affected players will need to move away from others and then keep moving to avoid getting hit. Aerial Support Swoop will summon adds around the platform that will dive bomb towards random players. Move out of these telegraphs as necessary. Maneuver Refraction Cannons will deal raid-wide damage and debuffs to anyone caught under the wing thrusters. Players will need to reposition away from the wings as they form to avoid excess damage. Maneuver Diffusion Cannon will deal high raid-wide damage. Healers beware. Aerial Support Bombardment will spawn 3 flight unit adds in each alliance section that will begin to slow cast. These adds must be destroyed before the cast goes off or they will explode for high raid-wide damage and anyone in its vicinity will die. While you're burning down the add, the boss will continue its regular attacks. Order High-Powered Laser will mark up a player in each alliance with the stack up marker. Each group will need to stack up to share the incoming damage. Life's Last Song will pulse out rings that will deal high damage and debuff anyone caught in the explosion. To avoid this, players will need to run between the gaps of the telegraphs before they explode. This will happen a number of times in succession, so make sure you keep an eye out. All of these mechanics will repeat with increased overlap until the boss is down. In the next section, each group will have one clump of adds to deal with. The large light artillery unit adds can cast Maneuver Volt Array that can and should be interrupted. If it isn't, it'll deal high raid-wide damage and apply a paralysis debuff on all players. Players will need to watch for AoE telegraphs on the ground and avoid overlapping attacks. Make sure you're not standing in any poop and burn each add down. Eventually, we find ourselves on the flight deck, facing off against 3 superior flight units, Alpha, Beta, and Chi. As soon as the encounter begins, the flight units will each cast a specific shield protocol on each alliance member that will limit them to attacking only one flight unit at a time. Maneuver Missile Command will cause a barrage of raid-wide AoE attacks. Healers be ready with those shields and heals. Maneuver Incendiary Bombing will target players with orange markers and eventually drop large AoE fire patches on the ground beneath them. Move these away from the group and don't stand in the poop. Maneuver High-Powered Laser will target one player from each alliance with a lineup marker. Stand together to soak the damage and make sure you're not in line with any of the other alliance members to avoid overlapping and killing one another. Formation Sharp Turn will have each flight unit move into a corner to form a triangle. Players will need to pay attention to which side thruster lights up, as this side of the boss will be targeted for a large column attack, and they'll need to move to the other side. The tricky part here is making sure you're not getting hit by the other units as well. So as soon as you position for your own unit, make sure you take a quick peek at the adjacent units and reposition away from those attacks as well. This usually works out with each alliance being in the corner behind their own ad. Maneuver Precision Guided Missile will target each tank for a heavy-hitting tank buster. Move away, cooldown, and heal as necessary. Formation Air Raid will have AoE circles spawn on the edges of the platform that will move across the platform in a straight line. Players will need to move out of their way and dip behind to ensure their safety. At the same time, the flight units will cast point-blank AoEs that will minimize the room you have to dodge the air raid missiles, so watch out. Formation Sliding Swipe will spawn 2 massive AoE circles on the platform, and each flight unit will fly to the opposite edge. From there, they will light up their left or right thruster before rushing across the platform to destroy anyone on the thruster side. To handle this, all players will first move away from the large circle telegraphs towards where the flight units are lining up. As they do so, they'll need to stay close to the center of the platform and watch the flight units light up their thrusters. Once identified, players can move to the right or left side of the platform to avoid getting cleaved. You'll have to dodge all 3 flight units, so make sure you don't move too far from the center in case you need to dodge back the other way. These mechanics will repeat until each flight unit is destroyed with some increased overlap and difficulty. Spread out if you're affected by AoE circles, and dodge these blooming AoE attacks as necessary. They don't go too far across the platform, so you can even easily outrange them. Once your Alliance's flight unit is destroyed, your shield debuff will fall off, and you'll be able to help the other Alliances destroy their units. The third encounter has us facing off against a heavy artillery unit. Maneuver Volt Array will deal high raid-wide damage. Healers beware. Operation Activate Laser Turret will cause the turret in the center of the room to throw out laser attacks in a specific pattern. Players will need to dodge out of each section as necessary. Maneuver High-Powered Laser will target 2 tanks with these markers and then blast in their direction for high damage. To avoid overlap, make sure the tanks spread in front of the boss away from the rest of the raid. Maneuver Unconventional Voltage will target random players with these orange markers and cones. This attack will soon blast in the direction of the marked players, so make sure you avoid overlapping more than one attack. Energy Bombardment will throw out bombs towards players that can be avoided by moving out of each AoE circle. At the same time, 3 larger AoE circles will form, and the boss will jump between all 3 before casting a room-wide donut attack. Players will need to move out of these circles while following the boss to get into melee range to avoid that final attack. Operation Activate Suppressive Unit will cause the number of bomb orbs to spawn from the outer edge and move towards the center of the room. Players will need to dodge these to avoid excess damage and debuffs. Support Pod will cause a number of pods to spawn around the room that will each throw out a specific attack. Players will need to keep an eye on the screens behind each pod to predict the attacks. Pods numbered 30 will throw out large point-blank AoEs, and players will need to move in between them to avoid getting hit. Pods numbered 10 will throw out large column attacks directly in front of them, and players will need to reposition to avoid these based on their position. The screens behind each pod also give players a countdown so you can see how much time you have to reposition before the attacks go off. Eventually, circles will form around the room that require a specific number of players in them to deactivate, or they will explode. These circles change color once enough players enter them, so make sure each one is deactivated. These mechanics will repeat until the boss is destroyed. One thing to look out for during the pod programs is the potential trickiness involved with the physical position of each pod, especially when the 10s and 30s begin to overlap. You'll need to carefully identify which pod is going to deal which attack and find the safe zone before it's too late. Be super careful when the pods arrange themselves to the side of the screen that they're linked to, as it can get pretty confusing. In this final section, the raid will need to make their way down a long corridor while destroying adds and barriers and dodging lasers and balls. There are both static lasers and lasers that target specific players, so watch your step. The final boss is the Compound. Mechanical Laceration will deal high raid-wide damage. Healers beware. Mechanical Decapitation will target the room with a massive donut attack. Players will need to move close to the boss within the spinning lasers to avoid damage. Mechanical Dissection will have 2 lasers form in front and behind the boss and begin to spin. Soon after, a long column attack will target in the direction of each laser. Players will need to move to the sides to avoid getting hit. Mechanical Contusion will cause a number of circles to form on the platform and target random players with circle markers. Move out of the circles and spread the marked players to avoid overlap. When the boss disappears, 2 open versions of it will form around the platform with lasers on either side. Safe lanes will form based on the position of each clone, and players will need to stand in them to avoid each attack. These mechanics will repeat until this form of the boss is destroyed and the next phase begins. After a short cutscene, the raid will face off against Compound 2P. Centrifugal Slice will deal high raid-wide damage. Healers beware. Relentless Spiral will cause a number of large AoE circles to form under players. Move out of these as necessary. Prime Blade will hit as either a point-blank AoE attack, a room-wide donut attack, or a frontal column attack, depending on the position of her sword during the cast. If she has her sword stuck in the ground in front of her, all players must move into melee range to avoid the donut attack. If she has her sword up behind her, all players must move away from her to avoid the point-blank AoE. If she has her sword held high above her head, all players must move out from in front of her. Next up, circles will form around the platform that will be linked to the boss. She will then begin to cast a random Prime Blade. These linked circles are indicators of where the boss can teleport to, but there's a trick. Links with sparks pulsing through them are the true indicators of where the boss will teleport, while the others will simply explode once the boss teleports. Immediately after the teleport, Prime Blade will go off and players will need to have already pre-positioned in the safe zone to avoid the attack. When the boss casts 3 parts Disdain, a player will be marked with this stack-up marker. The boss will then leap onto this player 3 times. The raid will need to stack with them for each hit to share the damage. Periodically, the boss will summon pods and a number of AoE circles will target random players. Spread these out as usual to avoid overlap. 4 parts resolve will tether 4 random players and mark them up from 1 to 4. The boss will then leap onto each odd-numbered player before turning towards the next even-numbered player and slash in their direction. To handle this, these 4 players can sped around the room while the rest of the group avoids them. When the boss moves into the middle and casts Reproduce, 4 clones will appear around the room. The boss will then cast Prime Blade, and players will need to adjust into the safe spot accordingly. Moments after, each clone will cast the exact same type of Prime Blade attack, and players will need to adjust again in relation to the clones. Energy compression will cause a number of meteor circles to spawn around the platform. Each circle requires 1 player to soak or the meteor will explode. These meteor rounds may also be affected by the force transport mechanic, and players will have to identify which meteor circles are going to teleport by looking for the link with the sparks pulsing through it. They'll need to pre-position into the teleport spot to properly soak the incoming meteor. She can summon pods that will explode from the edges in lines across the platform, forming specific safe zones. These pods can also be transported to different areas, so make sure you identify the safe zone after the teleportations happen. These mechanics will repeat until the boss is down. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. Up next, we'll dive into the Seat of Sacrifice Extreme. As always, thanks for watching. Till next time.